Welcome to part 2 of my Fox Alien Masuter Pro Nema 23 upgrade walkthrough. In this final part, we're going to finish the assembly of the Y rails, complete the assembly of the frame system, put the XZ gantry back in place. Then we'll do a walkthrough of connecting the drag chains and the full wiring harness. And finally, we'll complete the process by connecting to the control box and testing the machine. I'd like to apologize up front. There are some places throughout this video where my microphones did not work, so I have voiced over those sections. It doesn't sound quite as natural as me talking through the process while we work it out, but I do get all the pertinent details in place and give a good solid walkthrough here. So let's get started. So I'm going to get to work on the Y rails now, and side to side, they're almost identical. The difference is the Y1 rail has no electronics on it other than the motor itself. The Y2 rail has your limit switches on it. So for my purposes, this plate gets replaced by the upgrade, and I'm also replacing the wheels. All of the wheel hardware, the mounting, everything gets replaced in the upgrade. So I am literally just going to roll this off and set it aside and start rebuilding the new Y1 rail. The Y2 rail, same situation. The only difference is the limit switches get reused. So I need to take these 4 screws off, pull the wire through the hole, and hold on to those limit switches. But the whole rest of this assembly is gone. So I'll remove the limit switch plate. This is where the limit switches hit. And there are new plates for both ends of the Y2 rail for the limit switch to hit because they're in a different position in the new build. So I'll remove this, we'll roll it off the end, and those will just go away. So disassembly of the Y rails is pretty straightforward. If you're doing this yourself and you're not replacing the wheels, then you're going to need to take the wheels off the plates and hold on to those. All the hardware to replace the wheels, the screws, the bushings, and the eccentric nuts comes with the kit. But the wheels themselves you'll have to hold on to. For me, I'm putting new wheels on, so again, we'll just get rid of those. So since I don't have to salvage anything off the Y1, I'm going to get started with that one. So I'm going to take the Y2 rail and set it aside. Move all my tools out of the way here, and we'll get started on the Y1 rail. So this is very easy. We're going to roll this right off the end, and this now is done. It goes away. So this is the original Y1 rail, and we'll clean out the groove, give it a good wipe down with mineral spirits or denatured alcohol. And that's nice and clean now. So we're going to turn to the parts box here, and there's a couple of things we're going to need out of here. This is a new side for the Y rail. This is the new inside for the Y rail. And you'll notice these both have the holes on them for the limit switches, so it doesn't matter which one you grab. Be sure when you're pulling your parts for the Y1 and Y2 rails that you pull the right one for the correct side. The inside plate is the same on both sides. The outside plate is keyed by the recesses for the bolt heads, as you can see in the left image here, should be on the outside. And you can tell that by looking at the cut angle of the plate. That cut angle should go to the front, as I've indicated in the picture to the lower right. So what we need is the 2 main plates, the 4 wheels, 4 eccentric nuts, and 4 bushings to get started. In addition to that, we're going to need 4 M540s. and 4 M512 washers. So this plate, it's really important. The bottom holes are larger than the top holes. And that is just like on the x-axis, z-axis. That's because the flange on the eccentric nut fits inside those holes. Same thing on the outside plate. The bottom holes are a little bit larger. So we're going to get started by just putting these 4. To build this assembly, you're going to put the 4 bolts through the holes. I recommend maybe a piece of blue tape, or just get them in there and lay it down flat. You can build these with this laying down flat. I'm indicating here the recess for the bolt heads, and that helps you to be sure that you have the right plate for the right side. So we're going to put the bushings for the top and an eccentric nut on each bolt for the bottom. When you put those eccentric nuts on, make sure that the flange on the nut is to the outside and fits into that hole. Next, we're going to put the 4 wheels in. Now the wheels I order have a bearing on both sides and a washer in the middle, so what you see me doing here is using an Allen wrench just to center up that washer. Get it all centered up, drop those on. Here you can see there is no left side or right side to the wheel. Just make sure that the washer in the center is centered up when you try and slide it in there. Makes it easier to put on the bolt. And we're going to go ahead and put bushings on the outside, or the inside actually, of the top wheels. And this time with your eccentric nuts, make sure the flange is up so that those flanges fit into the larger holes on the inside plate. And the inside plate can be turned either way, it doesn't matter, as long as the larger holes are to the bottom, so that the flange of the eccentric nuts fits into those larger holes. Next, we're going to go ahead and put those washers on each screw. Once the washers are in place, we're going to need the lock nuts. And you definitely want to use the new lock nuts that came with this, as the fiber on the old lock nuts, that little fiber lock, wears on the old ones when you put them on and take them off. So these are new. Make sure you can see the fiber locking ring on these nuts right here. Make sure that's to the outside. You want it to be the last part that threads onto the bolt. I apologize, the screen capture is a little bit blurry, but you can see by the indicated red circles that each one of these eccentric nuts has a line burrowed into it. It's just basically an indent. You want to make sure those indents are in the same place. It doesn't have to be the bottom like I've done here. This just made it very easy to make sure they were all in the same place. This assures that that wheel is parallel to the sides. The eccentric nuts have an off-center hole that allows you to turn the nut and raise or lower the wheel in its current location. Then you can snug up and tighten the wheels on the rail assembly, and this will prevent any vertical motion while your machine is in use. Once you have all those in the same place, you can go ahead and tighten down all the nuts and bolts. Now that this whole assembly is tightened down, we're going to roll this onto the rail. And what you may find here is that your wheels are too snug, so you can't get it rolled into the grooves. This is where you use a wrench and turn those eccentric nuts. I work them about 1/4 of a turn at a time. Turn them all in the same direction, the same amount, till you get it opened enough that you can slide right onto that rail. Now, once you're on that rail, you want it to be snug, but you don't want it to be so tight that they're hard to move. Once you get those eccentric bolts set up so that you get good motion on the rail, we're going to go ahead and install the Y1 motor. Now, to install the Y1 motor, you're going to grab the motor and just put it in place, drop it through the hole, orient it in whatever direction you want so that your wire is facing in a way that's going to be convenient, and grab 4 M410 bolts. That's what the motor attaches with. And you go ahead and get those bolts started, but don't tighten them down all the way. Once you have all 4 bolts threaded and snugged, you can go back and tighten all 4 of them. The reason not to tighten them right away is because you want to have enough motion there to make sure you can get all 4 bolts in and get the threads started before you tighten it up. Now that the motor's in place, the next thing we need to do is adjust the gear so that the gear teeth ride right over the belt slot. And you can see here, I'm way off. That will never align with the belt slot. There are 3 motors that have gears on them in this kit. Make sure that the teeth on the gear are to the outside on all 3 motors before you begin assembly. You can see I already put this one together. The problem is to take that gear off, the inside plate of the assembly is in the way. So the only way to take the gear all the way off is to now turn around and remove the motor I've already attached. So that's going to take you time. It's best to look at all 3 of the motors that have gears before you get started and make sure that gear is placed on there properly before you do this. It'll save you some time. So I'm going to do that off camera, and then we'll get back to this assembly. So I've taken off and reinstalled the motor and turned the gear around. You can see now that the larger portion of the gear is on the back with the 2 set screws, and the teeth are to the front. So I'm going to loosen up the set screws so I can move that back and forth a little bit. And just by eye, we're going to line it up with the channel that the drive belt will go into. You're going to want those aligned as best as possible. Now, once the belt's on, you can do some fine tuning, but get it as close as you can right here. Now it's time to get the belt installed on the Y1 rail. So this is exactly the same as what we did for the X rail on top for the gantry. This requires the belt fixing bracket, the pinch fixing part for the belt, which I don't know exactly what to call that. It's the small piece that pinches down on the belt and keeps it in place on the bracket. There's an M5 T-nut for each end, and there's a set of those brackets for each end. So now that we got all the parts sitting here, we're going to go ahead and take the old belt, and you can see we'll stretch that with the new belt and trim it to a little bit longer than what the original belt was. That gives us a little bit to play with, and we can trim off the excess later. So get rid of the old belt, get it out of your way, take the new belt. Now this is much easier than it was on the X-axis. Everything's much more open, so you're going to be able to slide that through. It's going to be much easier to get it under the wheels and over the gear. This is a little bit different than the X-axis. There are no rollers, only the wheels. So you only have 2 wheels to get it under. So if you just kind of push it on each side, you'll get a little bit of a loop that'll come up in the middle, and you can grab that loop with your fingers or with an Allen wrench like I did here and pull it up over the top of the gear. And that's the placement for the belt. So let me show a diagram of that. So just to give a little bit better of a picture, on the y-axis 1 and 2, your belt runs under the wheel, over the top of the gear, and then under the other wheel. On the x-axis, you had 2 additional pulley wheels, but you don't have that on the y-axis. So it's a little bit more of a simplified path. Just make sure you get this properly put in place. Now this assembly is the same on both ends of the belt. You're going to slide the belt through and bend it over the bracket, just like you see me doing here. Then you're going to put the pressure plate in place and put 2 M35 bolts through the pressure plate and tighten that down. That'll hold that belt in place so it won't slip. You're going to do this on both ends. Then you'll need the M5 8 bolt and the M5 T-nut to go into the slot. So go ahead and slide that M5 T-nut into the slot. Grab your M5 cap bolt and the bracket. Make sure that there's no twist in your belt and that you're putting it in straight, and screw that right into the T-nut. You're going to leave about a ½ inch from the end of the rail when you snug down this bracket. And then just pull your belt snug across the entire assembly. After that's all snugged up, go ahead and flip your rail around. Now we're going to do the exact same thing on the other side, and I'll go ahead and we'll speed up the video and get through that. This is identical to what you just did. So now that we have all the belt hardware in place, we're going to turn to the Y-axis end plates. You can see here the new end plate on the left is significantly higher than the end plate on the right. So that's going to raise the XZ axis up quite a bit. And that's going to be nice for the machine. It gives you a lot more clearance under your Z axis. So we're going to put these on. We're only going to put the 2 bolts that hold the end brackets to the rail for right now. The bottom bolts that hold it to the frame, we'll do those later. To attach these, you're going to need 4 of the M520 flat bolts, 2 for each end. When you're setting these up, be sure to orient the brackets properly. You want to make sure that the recesses for the bolt heads go to the outside, and make sure they're oriented in the right direction so that the motor is to the outside and the L goes toward the inside of the frame. When you bolt these on, be sure that you use not the top hole, but the next 2 holes down. The top hole is for the tensioning mechanism for the belt. Next, you'll need 2 M520 flat cap bolts, the same bolts you just used to attach the rail. These will go through the top hole into the tensioning mechanism for the belt on both ends. And you may have to loosen your M5 bolt that you used, the M5-8 that you used to attach to the T-nut. You may need to loosen that up a little bit. Go ahead and get this started, pull it tight. And then you can do the same thing at the other end. And you want to leave somewhere between 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch space between that tensioning bracket and the end bracket. That gives you enough room to do some tensioning after everything's assembled. So now with the belt attached, both end brackets attached, and the tensioning system in place, I'm going to go ahead and play with this rail a little bit and adjust the eccentric nuts again to make sure that the motion on this rail is smooth, free enough that it can move on its own. Now, bear in mind, you will have tension from the motor now that the motor is attached. So it shouldn't just fall to the bottom. There's not enough weight to counteract the tension in the motor, but it should be able to be moved relatively easily by your hand, but still be tight enough that it stays in place. You can see here that I'm just tweaking with the nuts, trying to get it to a point where between the weight of the motor, the weight of the assembly, and the tension in the belt, we have good, smooth motion. Now that all this is complete, we're basically done with the Y1 rail. We're going to set that aside and start concentrating on the Y2 rail. Now, I mentioned earlier that most of the Y2 rail carriage assembly is going to get thrown away with my rebuild because I'm replacing the wheels, and that's really the only part that you would normally salvage other than the limit switches. So the limit switches are held on by 4 M314 cap bolts. Go ahead and take those 4 bolts off. And once those 4 bolts are off, there is a wire that runs through a hole on the bottom of the carriage. You're just going to have to feed that wire through. Be careful doing it. You don't want to break the end off. The plug is going to be the same plug that you use on the new assembly. Next thing we're going to do is remove the Y limit switch bump plates on both ends of the Y2 rail. And this is just 4 bolts. Go ahead and take those off and set those aside. So I'm going to speed this up, but we're going to go ahead and remove those limiter bump plates. I'm going to take the assembly off the rail. We're going to clean up this rail with denatured alcohol just like we did the other rails so that it's ready for assembly. So we've done this assembly once already. This is exactly the same as the previous Y assembly. This is just the Y2 rail. So we'll go ahead and speed up through this, jump up to the point where we put the limit switches in place. That's going to be coming right up here. So you're just going to tighten these all down just like you did on the previous one. And once you get this all tightened down, just lay this flat with the inside plate up. Set those limit switches in place. Make sure that the switch part is at the bottom of the plate. And then you're going to use the 4 M314 button style cap bolts and screw those down to the plate. Once those are in place, just tap those switches a little bit, make sure they're still clicking for you, that all the mechanics in them are working right. If you did this correctly, you didn't unwire anything, so all your wires should still be in the same place, and these are going to work just as soon as you put them in place. So something to note here with the new Y2 rail, there is no hole at the bottom. The previous Y2 rail had a hole where the limit switches for the Y-axis passed through that hole to get to the wiring harness and the drag chain. On the new assembly, there is no hole at the bottom. These are just going to go kind of up over the top of the motor and connect to the wiring harness that way. Now we're ready to continue the Y2 rail assembly. I'm going to speed this up. We'll jump through it. This is all identical to the original, the Y1 assembly that we did earlier, with the exception that at the end, we'll put those bump plates in for the Y limit switches. Once the Y1 assembly is completed, I'm going to go ahead and throw the frame on the table and get everything set up to attach the Y rails to the frame itself. And at that point, the natural audio while I was doing the process picks up again. This is after I changed my mic and realized that my battery had died. So we'll be back to no voiceover, just the regular audio. It's a little smoother from that point. Okay, so let's change up the angle here a little bit so you can see. And what I've done here is put one corner bolt in each one of the Y-axis onto the frame just to get us started, and that'll hold it all together so we can get going. It'll also keep my ends from beating up my nice cast iron table on my table saw. So next thing we need to do is put the Y limit switch hits on, and I'm going to put these in place and slide them down and see that they hit, and they do. They're going to hit right in the right spot. So we'll go ahead and get those put back on. Strike plate, that's the word I was looking for. This is the Y limit strike plate that I'm putting in place. And these were saved. These are not new strike plates. These were from the original build. So we really could have done this by just taking one of them off, so the old carriage could have slid off. But I took them both off because for some reason I thought it said that these were replaced in the kit, but they are not. Make sure it makes connect with that. And there it is. Click, click. We're making connection. So that's good. So now we're going to stand the Y rails up and put the second nut in, second bolt. There is no T-track nut, anything. These are milled holes threaded in the frame. So you can't miss them. They line up perfect. Don't quite torque it down yet because we want to make sure we got a little bit of play for when we put the XZ carriage on. The gantry is the word I'm looking for. And then we'll go back and tighten the entire machine up. It's got good motion, no issues. So now we're going to grab the X gantry and start putting it in place. I'm going to take one screw and set it on each side. We're going to bring these all the way down here where I can reach them pretty easy. Have one screw handy on each side, and we're going to do the top for each side. So let me grab that gantry. Got that threaded, just a couple of threads to hold it on there. Same thing on this side. Now don't let this go because it's top heavy. It's just going to flip around on you. Just got a couple of threads in there just to get it started. Now you can get your second one in place. Line it up. Get a couple of threads on that one, and now it won't twist on you. So you can get the other one in. Now just go ahead and snug all four of these up. And you want to make sure those screws seat in there just perfect, and that'll make sure that this is nice and true for you. That is making touch on the limit, making touch on the limit. So we're good on limit switches. Now we can start tightening up the frame. And we'll tighten that set screw up. So there's all our belt tensioning. The machine is mounted. All the gantry's moving clean. It is still a little tight. I will probably, after the video, go back and loosen this axis, the Y axis, just a little bit. Not with the belts, but with the, yeah, maybe with the belts, but potentially with the eccentric nuts too. But we can move forward from here and start putting the rest of this machine together. So the next thing we're going to do is put the router plate back in place. We're going to mount the router back on the plate. So snug these up, but don't tighten them super tight, because after the whole machine's together and you've confirmed that everything's working, you may need to loosen these a little bit to tram the machine left, right, forward, back, to get that spindle square in every direction. But you want to make sure it's on there good and tight. So there's the spindle. Next, we're going to put on all of the mounting hardware for the drag chain. And while we're doing that, we can go ahead and cut off all the extra. So a couple of mounting plates for the drag chain. The first one mounts right here. That was this little bracket right here is what we just mounted up. And that's where the Y-axis drag chain comes up and mounts right here. Next one we're going to mount is right here. That'll be the top of the X-axis drag chain. This one uses an M46 flathead screw, 2 of them. And these are little black. Some of the group of black screws that are in there. There's that one. Next, we're going to come up to this corner. So this spot right here is where this bracket mounts. And there are 2 T-nuts. And 2 M4 bolts. So I personally think the easiest way to start this is going to be to start your screw through, put it on the T-bolt, and then slide it in place. Get one of them started. Get the second one started. Make sure you put the T-bolts on in the right direction. Slide it into place, snug them up with your fingers. So I did a little jump ahead here and opened up the drag chain. I connected one end of the X and one end of the Y drag chain already and opened up the drag chain all the way across and removed the spindle wire. So eventually I will replace the ends of this spindle wire to connect it to my relay that starts my router automatically. So I'll need that wire, but I didn't need it in the drag chain. So what I'm going to do now is put the power cable for the router into the drag chain, and I have a air tube that I use for the air assist on my laser that I'm also going to put in the drag chain. Then we'll close up the drag chain. We'll connect the top of the X drag chain and the top of the Y drag chain. And for the most part at this point, it'll all be done. Then all we need to do is make all the connections. So this is my air tube. I'm going to go ahead and run this along with the power cable for the router. Now, there's a lot of room in this new drag chain, especially after taking the spindle power cable out of it. That left a lot of room inside this drag chain. So I'm going to start up here, and one by one, I'm going to click these back in place as I work my way down. And there's enough room in here that if once it's closed up, if I need to pull the wires back, pull them forward, either way, I can do that. But I'm going to start by pulling all these forward. And I'd like to get this down to the point where I'm past the curve. Part of the way I can do that is by lowering the curve. So now that I got some of those done, and push the wire out of the way for the motor here. And I want to make sure that I have plenty of cable for all of my connections. So all of these are going to need to be slid in and pulled forward just to make sure they come out. And we can adjust them from there. I just want to make sure I got a good handhold on all of them. And all the wires here do make this a little difficult, but just persevere, push through, get it done, and make sure they're nice and snug. And now if you roll this down, it'll be out of your way to go ahead and finish setting the rest of these in place. To get the power plug through, because of the big end on the power plug, we got to remove this end cap, which I had to do at the other end also. I just neglected to turn on the video, so I apologize for that. But we're going to go ahead and just wedge a screwdriver in here, just the same way we did at the other end earlier. Pop that off. Bring this up here as close as possible. And we're going to want to push all these through while we tug a little bit, because we're going to need some more line than is sticking out here. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. You don't want to pull too hard. You want to make sure you leave enough of the power cable in there. But you need enough line for all these to make sure that you're able to connect to everything they need to connect to. So this is the time to push them through and make sure you got enough. Now we're going to run the power cable in the hose tube through here. And I may have left a little too much hose up here, so I'm going to pull some of this hose back through. So I want to make sure I have plenty at the end. But at this end, it's really only got to be long enough to reach down to the bottom of the laser. So maybe a little more than that. And that feels about right. So you got a couple of cables here that need to stay at the end of your drag chain, because they're for the Y motor and your limit switch. So bundle all these back together. tuck them into that Y chain. Just take your time doing this. Make sure you get them all nice and neat. Get your air tube in. Get your power cable in for the router. And just snap that first one closed. And that'll hold it all together for you. And what I have here is my Y limit switch, my Y1 motor. And I believe this is my Y2 motor that lost its plug. Yeah, this will be my Y2 motor. So that one needs to stick out at the end here and be able to connect to the motor, and we'll do those connections in a little bit. Get the rest of those out of the way, just to have them out of the way for the moment. And push the X to that side so all of those are out of the way. The ones that need to stay hanging out, toss them off to the side. And now we can put that end cap back on. And go ahead and mount the Y drag chain on the top mounting. Getting the hole for the first one lined up with all this cable in the way can be a little challenging. Once the first one's lined up and you got it in, the second one's much easier to get in. So now you can just kind of pull the cables out of the way, get your second nut. That one good and snug. Let's go back to the first one, snug it up some more. And now your drag chain's completely connected to the machine. These three, we're going to pull through here and get them out of the way. And now the rest of these, we just want to work our way down and close up the drag chain clips one by one. So now what I'm seeing is that my power cable is not going to quite make it to the end. So I left a little too much out up here. So now we can just give it a pull. Give it a pull. And this is a good time to do this before you get the whole thing closed up. If you find it's a little tight anywhere, kind of feed it around. You might have to go back and unclip a few of these. Push and pull, push and pull. There it goes. So really, for my purposes, I only need to make sure that my plug comes out the end of the drag chain. I have a pigtail that I'll tie onto this, and I don't want a whole lot of wire up here anyway. The more of it is not hanging out up here, the less wire management there is to do up top. And there we are. Completed drag chain. So now let's get our wiring done. This is the Y limit, and there is a lot of cable here for the Y limit because it's got to be able to move all the way, but there doesn't need to be this much wire because it comes out right here. So you're going to end up coiling up a lot of this wire. This is your X1 motor or your Y1 motor that runs to the other side. And there are small clips on the bottom of this wiring tray that you can pop that into. These clips were really made for the old wire. So the new machine came with stick-on wire clips. So these clip to the bottom with some 3M, put the wire in there and just snap it shut. So we'll do that right now. There's the first connection of the new wiring harness. And there's a lot of extra cable on the end of this. So at some point you're going to want to get a cable tie, something, just to tie it up. There's no reason to have it hanging. You can wrap it around the motor if you want and just put a cable tie on it, tie it here. Come back over to this side and we're going to do the same thing with the Y2 motor. Now, again, there's a lot of cable here, so I'm going to wrap this around the motor just to make sure it's out of the way. And then plug that connection in. So now you got plenty of drag here. That wire is not going to bind up on anything. The Y limit sticks under here. There's plenty of cable here, so you can pull to this side and get it out in the light. Make sure everything lines up, plug it in. This is a lot of Y limit cable. So you're going to want to definitely coil this up, use a wire tie. I'll get out some wire ties here in a little while, and we'll just tie that off right there to make sure that never gets in the way of anything. Let me grab a wire tie. I always keep a handful of wire ties, different sizes on hand. So these are nice small ones. Not going to be a lot to cut off. We'll just coil this up. Now we never have to worry about that Y limit switch getting caught up on anything. And I'm going to go to the other side and tie up the Y1 wire just to make it a little neater. And I just have it wrapped around the motor, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to coil it and leave it wrapped right here behind the motor into a tight coil. I don't want to wrap it around the motor because this one's going to wrap a lot tighter to the motor than the other side did. The other side's got all that extra wire to hold it in place. This side would have to wrap tightly around the motor, and these motors get a little hot sometimes, so you don't want to do that and take the chance on having a problem with your wire because of the motor getting too hot. So that's out of the way. You can always push it up over the top, maybe put another wire tie around the top. There's other ways to tie it up. I am going to make it tied off a little higher. I'm just going to use that tensioning screw right there as an anchor point because we know our belt's tensioned nicely, and if we ever need to, we can just pull it off the loop and get it out of the way. But for now. That looks really good. And I like that the loose wires on these motors already have a little bit of a cable management on them. That's nice. Helps protect them a little bit. So now we're going to come up here and do all of our connections on the x-axis. So we're going to pull all these out of the way. First thing we're going to find, here's the work light connection. And there's a work light down here low. You just plug that in. Next is our X limit switch. So find your limit switch down here. Bring that wire up. Plug your X limit switches together. This is your Z limit switch. So the Z limit is on the other side. Plug that one in. It's your Z motor. And each one of these plugs is keyed, so they'll only plug in one way. And then this is your X motor. So there's all the plugs on the X-axis and the Y-axis. My tube, all I'm going to do with that is tuck it in right there. And when I need it, I'll plug it into the laser. When I don't need it, I'll tuck it in right there and it'll be out of the way. Something I did just realize that I forgot to do. I have one more very thin 2-strand wire that needs to go into this drag chain, and that's the power and control line for the laser. I'm not going to worry about that for this video, but you've seen the whole process. So putting that back in will just be a question of unsnap a few, put it in, snap those back, unsnap a few, put it in, snap those back, and work my way around until I'm all the way through. So now we want to clean things up a little bit. There is quite the wiring harness that comes off the end of this machine. And the nice thing is you've got a little bit of wire. There's some space here to be able to put your controller someplace convenient rather than having to have it right up against the machine. The wiring harness that came with it, these are kind of a pain, but once you get them started, they're not terrible. Best thing to do is spread it out with your fingers. Start it right at the end, and then just work your way down, pushing it in, pulling the other side. Make sure you don't have any wire in there. Snip that off. And there you go, cable management. It's going to be much nicer than having all that along the way. I would say if you really want this to stay nice and tight, doesn't matter which way the two pieces go together, they interlace into each other. So some places it overlaps, some places it underlaps. But putting a piece of tape at each end of it is not a bad idea. That'll help hold it all together. A little bit of electrical tape. And then you got plenty of end here to tie to your controller. And plenty of line here to go to your air pump and your power extender. So now, short of making first cuts, the only thing really left to do just to test is to put the controller up here on the table and get everything plugged into it, power it up, hit home. Let's make sure all the motors run, everything goes back to home, all the limit switches work. Then we'll move this thing over to where it belongs, put the spoil board back on it, and we'll do a first cut. So like I said, my first concern is let's get the controller out. So if you remember the size of the original controller, this one is just a little bit bigger. So this is the new controller. It's got controls on the front, all the plugs on the back. So I'm gonna turn this thing around right here with all the plugs on the back. And we'll move this over here where you can see. We'll go ahead and put all the interface together. And every one of these has a label on it. I will tell you, I did notice some of these labels come off pretty easy. So not a bad idea if you have a label maker to make new labels for all these before they fall off. But I'm going to start working. Bottom row is motors. Top row is limit switches, Z probe, and light. So this is my Y2 motor. And these are nice secure connections. Push it in there, twist it. It's my Y1 motor. Oop, look at that, I can read. I just plugged in my Y2 to the Z. It's my Y2, my Y1. These are also keyed, so they'll only fit in one way. So you know you'll have proper polarity. It's my Z motor. So all of the motor cables are a little thicker than the limit cables, so they're easy to feel. This is my X motor. Now the limit switches. This is the Z limit. The Y limit. The X limit. And last but not least is the handy dandy little work light. Now the remaining two plugs on here, there's a spot down here to plug the laser in. There's a spot to plug an offline controller in if you buy an offline controller from Fox Alien. There's a spot for your USB where you're going to connect to your computer. There's a spindle laser switch, Z probe, and spindle. My spindle is going to connect to my power relay that will then turn on the router. My Z probe I have in the box over there. We don't need that for testing. I'm going to slide the whole machine over here just a little bit. And you can see there is plenty of cable room here to be able to pretty well put your controller wherever you want to put it. It's a lot bigger, so having that functionality, or I should say that dynamic ability to put it somewhere other than right on the machine, is going to be really nice. I'm going to slide the machine forward. I want to make sure I got nothing interfering when the axis starts to move. And the way we're sitting right now, my y-axis would definitely hit that. So that should be enough room. Let me get a power cable. This is a big enough, beefy enough controller that it no longer has an AC adapter. Obviously, there is an AC transformer built into here because everything's running. These are all DC except for the motor. So, but you get just a direct plug, so you don't have to have another big wall wart like the old one. So there we are. We got power plugged in. All of our interfaces are on. Got all of our interfaces connected. All of the connections are made. Power's plugged in. Everything's plugged into the back of the controller. Let's give it a start. Good lights across the front. So we're all lit up across the front. I'm going to go ahead and hit the home button and let's see if she comes home. The Z limits are working. So there's a lot going on here. This is moving very, very slow. And part of that is all just settings. So there are settings we're going to have to change in here to set up the maximum speeds, maximum accelerations. Those are all tweakable settings. They are set for default. And generally, the setting for going home is usually something that you don't want it to do it too fast. Too slow is bad. Now, we didn't come all the way home, so something's wrong. Let's see if we can figure out what's going on here. So I can see the wires for my Z limit switches over there are catching a little bit on the drag chain down here. So that's definitely something I need to figure out why that's happening. I'm going to power this off. With it powered on, those motors hold their place really well. It's really difficult to move this machine manually. So don't like the way that Z limit, when it starts getting down close to the drag chain down here, it's catching and then wants to pull on those wires. And we definitely don't want those wires to start being an issue. So we'll have to figure out the best way to wire that up so it's not in the way. And it may just be a question of some double stick tape, sticking it to the bottom, pulling some of this wire out and letting it be a little more free. I'm going to pull a little bit of the wire out now, let it free up a little bit, turn it back on, we'll home it again, see if it gets caught up. Yeah, that was much better. So there's a little more play on that Z line over there. I think we're going to put some double stick tape on that anyway, because once the spoil board's in place, that wire is still kind of out and exposed. I want to make sure it gets hidden. But otherwise, right out of the box, get it set up, get it plugged in, turn it on, and bam, we're on. Let's see if the light works. Look at that, even the work light. So just for reference, that's how big the old controller was. So if you currently have this in a place where your old controller is out of the way and you don't have a lot of space around the machine, be aware if you're going to do this upgrade, you're going to need a little more space for the controller. You're going to need a little more clearance side to side because your Y motors are significantly bigger. And you're going to need a little more clearance at the top because you've raised this up almost 2 full extra inches. So that's the upgrade. So I noted earlier that after the full assembly, once I got to use the machine, that I did go ahead and change the Y limit switch wiring a little bit. So you can see here, previously I had this go under the carriage and under the rail, and that continued to be a problem getting caught up on things. On the previous, prior to the upgrade, there was a hole through the bottom of the plate where the wire ran, and on the new one, there's not. So all I did was ran it across the top. This has never interfered with the gear or the belt, so that's not a problem. and I pulled all the excess through, so there's not a lot of wire up there to give it any room to get down in the way of the wheels. But this is definitely what I recommend going forward. If you do this upgrade, just run your wiring for the Y limit switches up over the top. So that's it for the Fox Alien Masuter Pro Nema 23 upgrade. Again, this upgrade runs $399 at the current time when I made this video. It's a phenomenal upgrade. It really steps up this machine. I'm going to be doing some videos over the next week or two just showing the capabilities of the machine and what it'll do for a desktop CNC machine that's belt driven. It's definitely far overpowered now with these new motors. So I'm looking forward to getting some videos out for that. And if you're new to my channel, please be sure to like and subscribe. Follow me for more woodworking content, not only CNC content, but woodworking in general. I do a lot of wood turning, I do some furniture building, and I do a lot of CNC work. So like, subscribe, follow, and you'll see more content coming. I'm definitely trying to build my YouTube channel a little stronger. I currently have a big presence on TikTok, but my YouTube's a little lacking, so I am working on that. Thanks for coming along for the ride. Take a look at my other videos, and there is a part 1 to this video if you didn't see it. Also, in the description, you'll find links for the belts and the wheels that I used in my replacement while I did this machine, and I have used those same belts and wheels over the last 2.5 years every time I've done maintenance on my machine.